In the rain-slicked heart of Harbor City, Elowen Pierce learns that blood isn't thicker than water, it's colder. Falsely accused of ruining her family's prestige, she is cast into the mud by the very brother who shared her childhood. But when she chooses to shield a fallen elderly woman while the city's elite only film the scandal, she unknowingly triggers the gaze of the devil. Calder Knox doesn't believe in coincidences, he believes in claims. As he unbuttons his jacket to settle her debts with violence, Elowen realizes her survival isn't a miracle, it's an obsession. Before we continue, like this video if you've ever felt invisible in a world that only sees credentials and titles. Share it with someone who needs to hear that courage doesn't require permission. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens when one temp worker sees the truth everyone else is paid to ignore. Now let's continue. Chapter 1. The rain in Harbor City didn't wash things clean. It only turned the grit of the streets into a thick, swallowing sludge. I stood at the edge of the glass-canopied plaza, my thrift store hoodie soaked through, clutching a plastic bag containing my dinner, a single grocery store sandwich that had cost me 2 hours of dishwashing. Across the square, a sleek silver SUV idling at the curb signaled the arrival of the Pierce family. My former life. My brother, Julian, stepped out, looking every bit the prince of Harbor City's tech corridor, in a coat that cost more than my annual rent. He spotted me, and his face twisted into that familiar expression of disgusted pity. "Still playing the martyr, Elowen?" he called out, his voice cutting through the rhythmic patter of the rain. "Working in the kitchens? You really are determined to drag our name through the gutter." I didn't answer. I had learned months ago that words were just stones for them to throw back at me. I turned to walk away, but a sudden commotion near the fountain stopped me. An elderly woman, dressed in a simple wool coat that had seen better decades, had lost her footing on the slick marble. She went down hard, her knees hitting the wet stone with a sound that made my own joints ache. Her purse spilled open, spectacles skittering into a puddle. The crowd didn't move to help. This was Harbor City, where the only thing more valuable than money was clout. 3 teenagers in expensive streetwear pulled out their phones, angling for the best shot of the homeless lady in the mud. A group of socialites in designer heels walked a wide circle around her, whispering behind gloved hands about the eyesore ruining the plaza's aesthetic. "Look at that," Julian chuckled, stepping closer to me, his phone already out. "Nature taking its course. Maybe she should have stayed in the shadows where she belongs. Just like you." I felt a cold snap in my chest that had nothing to do with the rain. I dropped my grocery bag. "Elowen, don't you dare," Julian hissed, sensing my intent. "She's a vagrant. Don't embarrass me further by touching her." I ignored him. I stepped off the dry curb and into the mud. The water was freezing as it soaked into my worn sneakers, but I didn't stop until I was kneeling beside the woman. She looked up at me, her silver hair pinned neatly despite the fall, her eyes surprisingly calm for someone sitting in a puddle. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" I asked, my voice soft but steady. I reached out, placing a hand on her arm to steady her. "Just my pride, dear," she whispered, her gaze penetrating and far more observant than a vagrant's should be. "Let me help you up." As I began to shift her weight, a hand clamped onto the back of my head. The shock was a jolt of electricity. Julian's fingers knotted into my loosely braided hair, his knuckles grazing my scalp with a violence that made my vision swim. He yanked back, forcing my chin toward the gray sky. "I told you to stay away from the trash, you little wench." Julian snarled into my ear. "You think you can play hero while you're still a stain on our reputation? Get up, now." The pain was a hot, jagged line from my forehead to my neck. I heard the teenagers laugh. I saw the flash of a camera. The humiliation was a physical weight, heavier than the rain. I tried to reach for Julian's wrist, but he twisted harder, bending me backward over the woman I was trying to protect. "Let go, Julian," I managed to choke out, my hands trembling in the mud. "You're making a scene. I'm teaching you a lesson," he barked. "Since Mom and Dad didn't break you, I will." Then, the world stopped. It wasn't a sound that ended the chaos, but a sudden, absolute vacuum of it. The teenagers lowered their phones. The socialites froze. Even the rain seemed to hesitate as a fleet of 4 jet-black SUVs swept into the plaza, moving with the synchronized lethal intent of a shark fin breaking the water. They didn't park. They formed a perimeter. Julian's grip on my hair slackened just a fraction as the door of the lead vehicle opened. A man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a dark suit that seemed to absorb the very little light the afternoon provided. His hair was jet black, his eyes a cold steel blue that made the winter air feel like a summer breeze. "Calder Knox," someone whispered in the crowd, the name a terrified prayer. "The devil of Harbor City, the man who moved the mountains the Pierces only climbed." Calder didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the teenagers. He walked toward us, his footsteps rhythmic and heavy on the marble. With a terrifyingly fluid motion, he reached for the front of his jacket. He unbuttoned it. The gesture was ritualistic, the stripping away of the businessman to reveal the predator. Julian turned pale, his hand finally dropping from my hair as if I had turned into white-hot wire. I collapsed into the mud beside the elderly woman, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Calder stopped 3 feet away. He didn't look at me yet. He looked at Julian. "You have 5 seconds to disappear," Calder said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. "Before I decide that your family's reputation isn't the only thing worth ruining today." Julian didn't argue. He didn't even look back at me. He scrambled into his SUV and sped away, his tires screaming in the silence. Calder finally turned his gaze downward. He looked at the mud on my clothes, the redness at my scalp, and the way I was still shielding the elderly woman's arm. Then, he looked at the woman herself. "Mother," he said, his voice dropping an octave. "You've had your fun. The car is waiting." The elderly woman, Maribel Knox, smiled at me, a sharp, knowing glint in her eyes. "This one stayed, Calder. While the rest of your city filmed the mud, she stood in it." Calder Knox reached down. He didn't offer a hand to his mother first. He offered it to me. His palm was large, calloused, and felt like a promise of absolute, terrifying safety. "The Pierce family is done with you, Rabbit," he said, his blue eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that felt like a claim. "But I think I'm just getting started." I looked at his hand, then at his unbuttoned jacket, and I realized that the life I had been trying to build in the shadows was over. I reached out and took the devil's hand. Chapter 2. The first thing I registered was the scent, not the metallic tang of rain on pavement or the sour smell of the Harbor City subways, but the deep grounding aroma of sandalwood and expensive cedar. I opened my eyes to a ceiling that looked like it had been carved from the very clouds, a vast expanse of cream silk and recessed amber lighting. I tried to sit up, but a sharp sting at the base of my scalp reminded me of Julian's fingers. "Rest, child. The world isn't going anywhere for at least another hour." I turned my head slowly. Maribel Knox was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair by the window, the morning sun turning her silver hair into a halo. She was no longer wearing the muddy wool coat. She was draped in a housecoat of navy cashmere, looking every bit the matriarch of an empire. "Where am I?" I whispered, my voice sounding like dry paper. "You are in the Knox estate," she said, setting aside a small leather-bound book. "Specifically, in the East Wing. My son rarely allows guests, but he made an exception for the girl who treats grandmothers better than her own kin." I looked down at my hands. They were clean. The dirt of the plaza had been scrubbed away, and I was wearing a soft, oversized white t-shirt that smelled faintly of the same sandalwood I'd smelled upon waking. The memory of the previous night came back in a jagged rush, the rain, Julian's violence, and the terrifying, silent arrival of the man they called the devil. "I need to go to work," I said, panic flaring. "I have a shift at the diner. If I'm late again, they'll—" "You don't have a shift at the diner, Elowen," Maribel interrupted, her voice gentle but firm. "In fact, you don't have a shift anywhere. Calder bought the diner this morning. He found the manager's treatment of the staff inefficient. He's currently liquidating the property." I stared at her, stunned. "He did what? Why?" Maribel stood up and walked to the edge of the bed. She looked at me with a gaze that was both kind and chillingly objective. "Because of the Knox debt. In our world, loyalty and protection are the only currencies that matter. You stood in the mud to protect me, when you had nothing to gain and everything to lose. In doing so, you placed the Knox family in your debt, and Calder Knox does not like owing anyone." I shook my head, my breath hitching. "I don't want money. I just wanted to help. It isn't about money, dear. It's about a claim. By saving me, you became a part of our infrastructure. And my son is very protective of his assets." Before I could process the word asset, the heavy oak doors of the suite swung open. Calder Knox entered the room with a stride that seemed to shrink the massive space. He wasn't wearing the suit jacket from the night before. He was in a dark dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up, his expression a mask of cold, focused intent. He didn't look at his mother. He looked directly at the red marks on my neck. "Julian Pierce is at the gate," Calder said. His voice was a low vibration that seemed to rattle the window panes. I felt a cold spike of fear. "Julian, did he come to take me back?" "He came to negotiate," Calder said, a dark predatory tilt to his mouth. "He thinks your disappearance is a kidnapping he can use for a settlement. He brought 2 of his father's security contractors. He calls them his associates." Calder walked to the bedside table and picked up a small glass of water, handing it to me. His fingers brushed mine, and the heat of his skin was startling against my own. "Stay here," he commanded. "Mother, keep her inside." "Calder," Maribel said softly. Remember the neighbors. The neighbors know better than to look, he replied. He turned to leave, but I scrambled out of the bed, my legs wobbly. I couldn't explain why, but the idea of Julian facing Calder Knox made my stomach turn. Not for Julian's safety, but for the sheer gravity of what was about to happen. I followed him into the hallway, Maribel trailing behind with a resigned sigh. We reached the grand balcony that overlooked the estate's sweeping cobblestone driveway. Down below, Julian stood next to a black town car, flanked by two men in cheap suits who were trying very hard to look intimidating. Julian looked up, spotting me, and his face twisted into a sneer of triumph. "Lon, get down here," he shouted. "I've talked to the lawyers. You're coming home to sign the formal apology for the scandal you caused. These gentlemen will ensure you don't get lost again." Calder stepped to the edge of the balcony. He didn't shout back. He didn't even acknowledge Julian's words. Slowly, with a deliberate, agonizing precision, Calder reached for the buttons of his shirt. He unbuttoned the cuffs first, then the front, and shrugged the garment off, tossing it onto a stone bench. He stood there in the morning light, his broad shoulders and athletic build a stark contrast to the soft luxury of the house. He looked down at Julian's associates, like a man deciding which piece of trash to take out first. "Wait here," Calder said to me, his voice barely a whisper. He descended the stairs with a predatory grace. Julian started to say something, some legal threat about trespassing or kidnapping, but Calder didn't let him finish. He moved like a shadow. One moment he was walking, and the next, he had bridged the gap. The first security contractor reached for his belt, but Calder was faster. He caught the man's wrist, and I heard the sickening crunch of bone from the balcony. The man didn't even have time to scream before Calder's elbow connected with his jaw, sending him spiraling into the gravel. The second man tried to intervene, but Calder caught him mid-swing, spinning him around and slamming him face first into the hood of Julian's own car. It wasn't a fight. It was a systematic dismantling. Julian backed away, his face turning a translucent shade of gray. You can't do this. Do you know who my father is?" Calder stepped into Julian's space, his bare chest heaving slightly with the exertion. "He didn't strike my brother. Instead, he reached out and gripped Julian's throat, lifting him until his toes were barely touching the gravel. I know exactly who your father is," Calder hissed. "He's the man whose accounts I am currently draining. He's the man whose reputation I am going to use to pave the driveway of this estate." Calder leaned in, his voice dropping to a terrifying register. "You put your hands in her hair yesterday. You made her bleed in the mud. For that I should kill you. But instead I'm going to let you live just long enough to see your family lose everything. Tell your father that Eloan Pierce is no longer a name he is allowed to speak. She belongs to the Knox debt now, and the debt is unpaid." Calder dropped him. Julian hit the ground, gasping for air, scrambled into the passenger seat of the car and sped away, leaving his unconscious associates in the dirt. Calder stood in the driveway, the morning sun glinting off the sweat on his back. He didn't look at the carnage he'd left behind. He turned and looked up at the balcony, his steel blue eyes locking onto mine. There was no apology in his gaze, no softness. There was only a dark, possessive certainty. I realized then that the safety Maribel had promised was a double-edged sword. Julian was gone, but I hadn't been returned to my life. I had been pulled into a world where violence was a language, and I was the subject of the conversation. Calder started back up the stairs, his bare chest a map of scars and strength. As he reached the balcony, he didn't put his shirt back on. He stopped in front of me, his shadow swallowing me whole. "The trash has been handled, Rabbit," he said, his voice returning to that low, grounding vibration. "Now let's talk about your future." Chapter 3. The afternoon light filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Knox library, casting long, sharp shadows across the mahogany shelves. I sat on the edge of a velvet chaise, the silence of the estate feeling more like a physical weight than a comfort. In my lap sat a thick, cream-colored envelope that had been delivered by a courier whose hands had been shaking. It bore the gold-embossed crest of the Pierce family, a symbol that used to mean safety, but now only signaled a final, cold rejection. I opened it with trembling fingers. There was no letter, no final word of regret from my mother, no explanation from my father. There was only a single legal document, a formal disownment and reputation severance agreement. It stated, in clinical, heartless legalese, that Eloan Pierce was no longer a member of the bloodline, that all rights to inheritance were void, and that I was strictly prohibited from using the family name for any personal or professional gain. A soft, dry chuckle came from the shadows of the desk. I looked up to see Calder leaning against the heavy oak table, his shirt once again crisp and buttoned, though his tie remained loose. He held a glass of dark liquid in one hand, and a mobile phone in the other. He had been watching me read the destruction of my identity, as if he were watching a weather report. They move fast when they're afraid, Calder said, his voice a low, melodic vibration. Julian went home and told them the devil was at the door, so they decided to throw you to the wolves to save the house. It's a classic move. Sacrifice the child to save the kingdom. I have nothing now, I whispered, the paper crinkling in my grip. No name, no history, just a scar and a thrift store hoodie. Calder straightened up and walked toward me, his presence filling the room until the air felt tight. He didn't look pitying, he looked amused. You've never had anything from them, Rabbit. You had a cage with a fancy name on the door. Now you just have the truth. He reached into his inner breast pocket and pulled out a folded piece of parchment, much older and more substantial than the flimsy notice in my hand. He tossed it onto the chaise beside me. What is this? I asked, unfolding it. That, Calder said, taking a slow sip of his drink, is the deed to the Pierce Manor in the folder. Heights, the gardens, the 6-car garage, the master suite where your father currently sleeps. All of it. I scanned the document, my eyes widening as I saw the signature at the bottom. It wasn't my father's name. It was Knox Industries. The date of the sale was listed as 3 hours ago. You bought it. I looked up at him, stunned. How? My father would never sell. That house has been in the family for 3 generations. Your father didn't sell it, Calder replied, a dark, predatory glint in his steel blue eyes. The bank sold it. I spent the morning buying up their outstanding debt, through 3 different shell companies. When I called in the markers at noon, they had 20 minutes to produce the capital. They couldn't, so I took the collateral. He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the disownment notice. They think they disowned you to save their reputation. They don't realize that they have no reputation left, because they have no floor beneath their feet. By sunset, Julian and your parents will receive their own notice. They have 48 hours to vacate. I'm thinking of turning the ballroom into a kennel for the hounds. I felt a dizzying rush of vertigo. My family was being erased by the very man who was holding me captive in a gilded debt. Why are you doing this, Calder? Is it really just because I helped your mother? He reached out, his thumb catching my chin and tilting my face upward. His touch was electric, a searing heat that made my breath hitch. I told you, I don't like owing people. But more than that, I don't like waste. The Pierces wasted a spirit like yours. They treated a diamond like gravel. I'm simply reallocating the asset. He took the disownment paper from my hand and walked over to the fireplace, tossing it into the dying embers. We watched together as the Pierce name blackened and curled into ash. You aren't Pierce anymore, he said, turning back to me. His voice was no longer a vibration, it was a command. And you aren't a ghost. You belong to the Knox debt. And as of today, that makes you the most dangerous woman in Harbor City, because the man who owns your house, your name and your future, is me. I looked at the deed on the chaise, then at the man standing over me. I was no longer a daughter, but I was no longer a victim. I was something new, something forged in the devil's shadow. As Calder reached down to pull me to my feet, I realized that the Pierce family hadn't thrown me to the wolves. They had accidentally handed me to the Alpha. Chapter 4. The morning air in Harbor City tasted of salt and exhaust, a familiar bitterness that usually grounded me. I had walked nearly 3 miles from the Knox estate, refusing the fleet of black cars that had idled in the driveway like a funeral procession. I needed the rhythm of the pavement under my worn sneakers to remind me that I still existed outside of Calder's shadow. I needed to believe that the rabbit he spoke of was just a nickname, not a new identity. The daily grind was a narrow, grease-slicked cafe squeezed between 2 towering skyscrapers, a place where the light rarely hit the floor. It was my sanctuary of the mundane. I pushed through the glass door, the familiar bell chiming above, ready to lose myself in the steam of the espresso machine and the demands of impatient commuters. I'm late, I know, I said, reaching for my apron behind the counter. I'll stay over for the late shift to make up the... I stopped. The cafe was silent. Usually, by 8 o'clock, the air was a chaotic symphony of clinking ceramic and shouted orders. Today, it felt like a tomb. 3 men in charcoal gray suits sat at the small bistro tables. They weren't eating. They weren't scrolling through their phones. They were sitting with their backs to the wall, eyes fixed on the entrance. They had the posture of coiled springs. Outside, 2 more stood by the window, their hands folded in front of them, earpieces glinting in the pale morning light. Elowen, my boss Miller, stammered. He was standing by the pastry case, his hands trembling so violently, he nearly dropped a tray of muffins. You can't be here. What's happening, Miller? Who are these people? I looked at the man closest to me. He didn't blink. He just adjusted his stance, his jacket flaring just enough to reveal the holster tucked against his ribs. A man came by an hour ago, Miller whispered, his eyes darting toward the street. He didn't identify himself. He just handed me a check that covers the next 5 years of revenue, and told me the cafe was under, quote, discretionary protection. He said if a single person so much as looked at you the wrong way, he'd turn this place into a parking lot. My heart hammered against my ribs. Calder. I turned toward the door, determined to leave, but the two men outside stepped together, blocking the exit. They didn't touch me. They didn't even speak. They simply became a wall of suits and muscle. Move, I commanded, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted. Mr. Knox has requested that you finish your shift in safety, Ms. Mercer, the tallest one said. His voice was as flat and cold as the marble in the estate. We are here to ensure that the environment remains controlled. I looked back at Miller. He looked terrified. Behind him, the regular customers, the construction workers who liked extra sugar, the harried paralegals, were standing on the sidewalk, peering through the glass with expressions of confusion and fear. None of them dared to enter. The daily grind had been transformed into a fortress, a high-security cage, where the only prisoner was me. I realized then that Calder hadn't just bought my family's home. He was buying the world around me, piece by piece, until there was nowhere left for me to stand that didn't belong to him. He was suffocating my independence with the very thing I had never had. Absolute, terrifying security. I grabbed a rag and began to scrub the counter, my knuckles white. I scrubbed until the stainless steel shined like a mirror, but I couldn't scrub away the feeling of being watched. Every move I made was tracked by 5 sets of eyes. When a stray delivery driver tried to open the door, he was intercepted before his hand touched the handle, redirected with a quiet, menacing word that sent him running. I wasn't a waitress anymore. I was a relic in a display case. The phone on the counter buzzed. It was a private number. I picked it up, my hand shaking. Do you like the coffee, Rabbit? Calder's voice was a low, dark vibration that seemed to fill the small space. You're ruining my life, I hissed, turning away from Miller. You're scaring my friends. You're scaring me. I am securing you, he corrected. The Pierce family sent another negotiator to your apartment this morning. He didn't find you, but he did find the men I left there. He won't be walking for a month. You think you can go back to being normal, Eloin. You think you can pour coffee and pretend the world hasn't seen you stand in the mud for a Knox. I just want to be me. You are you, he said, and I could almost hear the predatory tilt of his smile. You are the woman who has the devil's attention. That is a permanent state of being. You can work your shift, you can scrub your counters, but you will do it behind my shield. Or you can come home, and we can stop pretending that this cafe is anything more than a memory. I looked at the men in the suits. I looked at the empty chairs. The life I had built, the quiet, struggling, honest life, was gone. It had been incinerated the moment Calder Knox unbuttoned his jacket in the plaza. I untied my apron and dropped it on the floor. I didn't look at Miller. I didn't look at the guards. I walked to the door, and this time, the wall of suits parted. They followed me to the curb, where a black sedan was already idling. As I slid into the leather seat, the scent of sandalwood and cedar enveloped me. I looked out the window at the humble cafe, now a fortified outpost in a war one hadn't asked to fight. I realized then that normal was a luxury I could no longer afford. The cage was made of gold, but it was still a cage, and the only person with the key was currently waiting for me at the end of the drive. Chapter 5. The silence of the Knox estate was deceptive. It was a silence born of absolute control, yet outside its iron gates, the Pierce family was frantically trying to strike matches in a hurricane. I spent my days in the glass-walled study, surrounded by the archives of an empire I didn't yet understand. While the weight of my new reality pressed against my chest, Calder was rarely home, but his presence was a constant, felt in the way the staff bowed when I passed and the way my favorite tea appeared on my desk without a word being spoken. The storm broke on a Tuesday afternoon. I was reviewing a series of logistics manifests when the doors to the study were thrown open. Calder didn't walk in. He invaded. He was followed by a frantic-looking man in a lab coat, a technician from Knox Industries, and a security detail that looked ready to raise the city. Calder's face was a mask of cold, concentrated fury, his steel blue eyes narrowed into lethal slits. He didn't speak. He simply tossed a tablet onto the table in front of me. The screen was filled with headlines from Harbor City's primary financial tabloids. Knox security breached, abandoned Pierce heiress accused of corporate espionage. The article was a masterpiece of fabrication. It claimed that I, acting out of spite for being disowned, had used my access to the Knox estate to leak the blueprints for a multi-billion-dollar renewable energy project to a rival firm in Asia. There were screenshots of emails, supposedly sent from my personal account, containing encrypted files that only a high-level Knox executive should have seen. I didn't do this, I whispered, the words catching in my throat. I looked up at Calder, expecting to see suspicion, or perhaps the same predatory judgment he had used on Julian. I know you didn't, he said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. "If I thought for a second you were capable of such a clumsy betrayal, you wouldn't be sitting in that chair. You'd be at the bottom of the harbor." He turned to the technician. "Show her." The man stepped forward, tapping a sequence of keys on his own device. "Ms. Mercer, the emails were sent using a sophisticated spoofing technique. They appeared to originate from your laptop's IP address. To any outside investigator, it looks like a definitive paper trail. The Pierce family's legal team has already contacted the district attorney's office, demanding your arrest for corporate theft." "They want to ruin me," I said, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "They can't have my name, so they want to take my freedom." "Julian, he's behind this, isn't he?" "Julian is the architect," Calder said, walking to the window and looking out over the city he owned. "Your father provided the funding. They think that by making you a liability, they'll force me to cast you out. They believe I value my balance sheet more than I value my rabbit." He turned back to me, and the intensity of his gaze was a physical weight. "They spent 40 years thinking they were the smartest people in the room because they were the richest. They forgot that in Harbor City I don't just participate in the network. I am the network." He picked up a phone and dialed a single number. "Execute the sweep, now." Across the room, a large monitor on the wall flickered to life. It didn't show the news. It showed a map of a server farm located in the industrial district of the city, a facility owned by a third-party provider that the Pierces had used to route their fake emails. "Your brother thought he was clever," Calder said, his voice dropping to a terrifying register. "He paid a premium for a secure and anonymous server to host the spoofing software. He thought he was hiding in a dark corner where I couldn't find him." Calder stepped toward the screen, pointing to a glowing red node on the map. "What Julian doesn't know is that I bought that provider 3 months ago. I didn't change the name on the door. I didn't notify the clients. I just sat in the shadows and waited for someone to be foolish enough to use my own wires to hang themselves." He looked at me, a dark predatory tilt to his smile. "I have the original logs. I have the keystroke recordings from the terminal Julian used in your father's library. I have the video of him laughing as he hit the send button on the leak that was supposed to destroy you." I felt a dizzying rush of relief, followed by a cold, sharp anger. "What are you going to do with it?" "I'm not going to the police," Calder said, reaching for the buttons of his jacket. He unbuttoned the first one, the sound a sharp click in the quiet room. "The police are for people who need a judge to tell them who is right. I'm going to send the original, unedited logs to every one of the Pierce's remaining investors. I'm going to show them that their quote prestigious partners are so desperate and incompetent that they tried to hack a Knox server from a Knox-owned facility." He unbuttoned the second button, his shoulders shifting with a lethal grace. "By the time the markets open tomorrow, the Pierce name won't just be severed from you. It will be synonymous with suicide. They tried to steal your reputation, Eloin. So I am going to erase theirs." He walked over to me, stopping just inches from my chair. He reached out, his fingers brushing the hair away from my face. His touch was warm, but his eyes were cold as ice. "They think they can play in my dirt," he whispered. "They're about to find out that when you dig a hole for a Knox, you're really just digging your own grave." The phone in his pocket buzzed. He didn't look at it. He didn't need to. The dismantling had begun. The Pierce family had tried to use the devil's own tools against him, and in doing so, they had invited the devil into their very living room. As Calder reached down to pull me to my feet, I realized that I wasn't just safe. I was the reason the city was about to burn. Chapter 6. The morning air was crisp, and carried the biting chill of the harbor as I was ushered into a waiting vintage Rolls-Royce. Calder wasn't with us. He had been gone since dawn, likely overseeing the final burial of the Pierce reputation. Instead, I sat beside Maribel Knox. She was dressed in a suit of severe midnight blue silk, her presence commanding even without the terrifying physical threat her son carried. "Calder moves with fire," Maribel said as the car wound through the industrial district, far from the polished glass of the heights. "It is effective. It is necessary. But fire leaves ash, Eloin. Sometimes, one needs a garden to grow instead." "Where are we going, Maribel?" I asked, smoothing the fabric of the dark, structured coat she had insisted I wear. "To a meeting of the unseen," she replied, her eyes fixed on the passing brick warehouses. "The men who control the docks. They are old world, superstitious, and currently very angry. Calder wants to break them. I want to see if you can reach them." We arrived at a nondescript social club buried beneath a seafood packing plant. The air was thick with the scent of salt, tobacco, and decades of secrets. As we entered the back room, the conversation died instantly. 5 men sat around a circular table, their faces weathered like driftwood, their hands scarred from years of labor and conflict. These were the longshoremen union heads, the men who could paralyze the city's heart if they felt ignored. At the center sat Silas, a man whose skin looked like cured leather and whose eyes held a weary, jagged light. He didn't look at me. He looked at Maribel with a scowl. "You brought the devil's girl to our table, Maribel," Silas spat, his voice like gravel. "Your son has frozen our pensions. He's diverted our routes to his private hubs. We've got men whose children aren't eating because he wants to optimize the harbor." Maribel didn't flinch. She sat down with a grace that made the rough wooden chair look like a throne. "My son optimizes. It is his nature. But I brought Elowyn because she understands a language he has forgotten." Silas turned his gaze to me, heavy with decades of resentment. "And what's that? The language of thrift stores and hoodies? We heard about you, girl. The Pierce disgrace." I took a breath, the ozone and cedar of the Knox estate feeling a world away. I stepped forward, not toward the table, but toward a small trembling man sitting in the corner, an assistant or a younger relative who was clutching a stack of medical bills. His hands were shaking so violently the paper rattled. I didn't talk about logistics. I didn't talk about the Knox debt. I reached into my bag and pulled out a small thermos flask of tea and a wrapped bundle of pastries Maribel's cook had prepared. I walked over to the man in the corner and knelt, placing the food on the crate beside him. "Your hands are cold," I said softly, my voice a quiet contrast to the aggressive posturing in the room. "And you haven't eaten since yesterday morning. The stress of the harbor doesn't get easier on an empty stomach." The room went silent. It wasn't the silence of fear that followed Calder. It was the silence of confusion. I turned back to Silas, who was watching me with a furrowed brow. "You're angry because you think Calder sees you as numbers on a ledger," I said, standing tall but keeping my tone gentle. "And you're right, he does. But those medical bills in the corner? Those aren't numbers. That's Silas's grandson, isn't it? The one with the respiratory infection from the coal dust at the old pier." Silas stiffened. "How do you know that?" "Because I used to wash the floors at the clinic where he was taken," I replied. "I saw the names. I saw the worry. Calder wants to close the old pier because it's inefficient. I want him to close it because it's killing your children. If you agree to the new routes, I will make sure the Knox Foundation builds the new medical center at the North Gate, not as a bribe, but as a condition of my own employment." I looked at Maribel, who remained impassive, but there was a glint of triumph in her eyes. I looked back at Silas. "Violence will get you a temporary truce. Kindness will get you a future. Which one do you want to take back to your men?" Silas looked at the man in the corner, who was now drinking the tea, his shaking hands finally still. The old longshoreman leaned back, the tension bleeding out of his shoulders. "The devil's girl has a silver tongue, and a heart that hasn't been turned to stone yet." He reached for a pen. "Tell the boy we'll sign, but only if she's the one delivering the checks." The ride back to the estate was quiet, until we pulled into the drive. Calder was waiting on the steps, his jacket off, his sleeves rolled up as if he had been ready to launch a strike the moment we failed. He watched us exit the car, his steel blue eyes searching mine for any sign of distress. "They signed," Maribel said, walking past him with a knowing smile. "And they didn't even require a single broken rib. Your rabbit is a more effective diplomat than your entire legal team, Calder." Maribel disappeared into the house, leaving me alone with him. Calder stepped into my space, his presence a dark, suffocating heat. He didn't look at the signed contracts in my hand. He looked at the way I stood, no longer the girl cowering in the mud, but a woman who had just moved a mountain with a whisper. "What did you do to them?" he asked, his voice a low, possessive vibration. "I reminded them that they were human," I said. "And I reminded them that I was too." Calder reached out, his hand cupping the back of my neck, his thumb grazing the sensitive skin just below my ear. His touch was electric, a claim that went deeper than any legal deed. I could see the obsession darkening his gaze, a realization that he hadn't just saved a victim, he had discovered a rare, quiet power that he now had no intention of ever letting go. "You're a dangerous creature, Elowyn," he whispered, leaning down until his breath stirred my hair. "They think they can reach you because you're kind. They don't realize that your kindness is now under my protection, and heaven help the man who mistakes your mercy for weakness." He pulled me closer, his shadow swallowing me whole. In that moment I realized that my success at the docks hadn't lessened my debt to him. It had only made the cage more beautiful, and the devil more determined to keep the door locked. Chapter 7. The rain had returned to Harbor City, but from the vantage point of the Knox Library, it was merely a silent, blurred texture against the reinforced glass. I sat curled in a chair, a book in my lap that I wasn't reading, watching the way the moisture clung to the windows. The Pierce family manor was gone, their accounts were bleeding dry, and the devil's rabbit had become the talk of the city's underground. I felt like a spectator in my own life, waiting for the final collapse of the world I used to fear. The heavy doors opened, and Calder walked in. He wasn't alone. Two of his men were hauling a bedraggled figure between them, someone who looked like they had been dragged through the very mud I had once knelt in. It was Julian. He looked pathetic, His designer suit was torn. His hair, usually styled to perfection, was plastered to his forehead, and his eyes were darting around the room with the frantic, wet energy of a trapped rodent. When his gaze landed on me, he didn't look at me with the usual disgust. He looked at me with a desperate, terrifying hope. "Eloin," he croaked, his voice cracking. "Eloin, tell him we're family. Tell him Dad is sick. The stress. The bank. He's in the hospital, El." I stood up slowly, the book sliding to the floor with a dull thud. I looked at Julian, and felt a strange, hollow sensation. I expected to feel anger, or perhaps a flicker of the old fear that used to make my stomach turn. Instead, I felt nothing but a distant, clinical exhaustion. "He's not in the hospital, Julian," Calder said, his voice a low, melodic vibration that seemed to suck the air out of the room. "He's at the country club, trying to convince the board not to revoke his membership. You're the one who's sick. Sick with the realization that the well has finally run dry." Calder walked over to the sideboard and poured a glass of amber liquid, his movements fluid and precise. He didn't look at Julian. He looked at me. "Your brother came to my office this afternoon, Eloin. He didn't come to check on your health. He came to offer a trade. He wanted to sell me the, quote, exclusive rights to your childhood journals, and some old family photos, in exchange for a bridge loan." I felt a cold shiver trace my spine. "You tried to sell my memories, Julian. After you threw me away. I was desperate," Julian shrieked, struggling against the grip of the guards. "Everything is gone. The cars, the summer house, they're taking everything. You're living in luxury now, Eloin. You're the devil's favorite. What's a little money to you? Just tell him to sign the check." Calder set the glass down with a sharp clack. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He walked toward Julian, his presence expanding, until Julian seemed to shrink into the floorboards. "I don't like the way you speak to her," Calder said softly. "And I don't like the way you stand in her presence. You haven't earned the right to stand, Julian." With a sudden violent grace, Calder kicked the back of Julian's knees. Julian went down hard, his kneecaps hitting the mahogany floor with a sickening crack. The guards forced his head down until he was doubled over, his face inches from the carpet. "You like to hit things that are smaller than you, don't you?" Calder asked, leaning down until he was eye level with my brother. "I saw the medical records, Julian. The falls Eloin had when she was 10. The clumsiness she exhibited when she was 14. I've seen the way you knotted your fingers in her hair at the plaza." Calder reached out and gripped the back of Julian's neck, his fingers tightening with a slow, agonizing pressure. "Every time you raised your hand against her, you were drawing a check you couldn't cash. Well, the bill is due today." "I'm sorry," Julian sobbed, his face turning a deep, mottled purple. "I'm sorry, Eloin. I'll never touch you again. Just make him stop." "Don't apologize to me," Calder hissed, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on my arm stand up. "Apologize to her, for every bruise, for every lie, for every night she spent in the dark, because you convinced your parents she was the problem." "I'm sorry, Eloin," Julian gasped, the words muffled by the floor. "I was jealous. You were always the better one. I'm sorry." I walked toward them, stopping just out of Julian's reach. I looked down at the back of his head, the same head I used to watch at the dinner table, while I waited for a kind word that never came. He looked small. He looked like the monster under the bed when you finally turn the lights on and realize it's just a pile of dirty clothes. "You aren't sorry, Julian," I said, my voice sounding incredibly far away. "You're just caught. You would do it all again if you thought you could get away with it. You don't get to buy your way out of this with a few tears." I looked at Calder. He was watching me with an intense, possessive hunger, waiting for the signal to do more. He wanted me to give the word. He wanted to break Julian's bones the way Julian had broken my spirit. "Let him go, Calder," I said. Calder's eyes narrowed. "He hasn't finished his penance, Rabbit." "There is no penance for people like him," I replied. "Keeping him here just keeps the Pierce name in this room. I want him gone. I want him to go back to the street and realize that no one is coming to save him. That's a worse death than anything you can do to him." Calder stared at me for a long beat, his thumb tracing the line of his jaw. Then, a slow, dark smile spread across his face. "You're more ruthless than I gave you credit for. I like that." He released his grip and stepped back, wiping his hands on a silk handkerchief as if he had touched something diseased. "Get him out of my sight. Drop him in the industrial district, and make sure the local debt collectors know exactly where he is." The guards hauled Julian out of the room, his pleas for mercy echoing down the hall until they were cut off by the heavy front doors. The library was silent again, save for the rain. Calder walked over to me, his shadow falling over me like a shroud. He reached out and tucked a stray hair behind my ear, his touch lingering on the sensitive skin of my neck. "You handled that well," he whispered, leaning down until his breath stirred my hair. "But you're still shaking." "He was my brother," I said, a single tear escaping and rolling down my cheek. I just wanted them to love me, Calder. That's all I ever wanted. Calder pulled me into him, his chest a solid, immovable wall against my grief. He didn't offer empty words or comfort. He simply held me with a terrifying, absolute possessiveness. They were fools, Elowen, he said into my hair. They had the sun in their hands, and they tried to extinguish it. But don't worry, you don't need their love. You have my obsession, and I promise you, that is a much more permanent thing. I closed my eyes and leaned into the devil, realizing that the Pierce family was finally dead to me. But in their place, a new, much more dangerous ghost had taken up residence. Chapter 8. The storm outside the estate had shifted from a violent downpour to a thick, suffocating fog that erased the horizon of Harbor City. Inside, the master suite was bathed in the flickering orange glow of the fireplace, the only light cutting through the oppressive shadows. I sat on the edge of the sprawling bed, wrapped in a robe of heavy silk that felt like liquid against my skin. The silence of the house usually felt like a shield, but tonight, it felt like a confession. I didn't hear Calder enter. He didn't use the doors like a guest. He moved through his own halls with the silent, predatory grace of someone who owned the air itself. I only knew he was there when the temperature in the room seemed to rise, and the scent of sandalwood and cold rain enveloped me. "You've been staring at those flames for an hour, Rabbit," he said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that settled in the marrow of my bones. He stood behind me, his reflection caught in the dark glass of the window. He had discarded his jacket and tie, the top buttons of his shirt opened to reveal the hard, corded muscle of his neck. He looked at me with an intensity that was almost physical, his steel blue eyes tracing the line of my shoulders with a hunger he no longer bothered to hide. "I was thinking about the night it happened," I whispered, my voice barely audible over the crackle of the logs. "The night they stopped being my family." Calder stepped closer, his large, calloused hand reaching out to rest on my shoulder. His thumb brushed against the edge of the silk robe, pushing it back, just an inch. I flinched, a reflex born of years of hiding, and instinctively pulled the fabric higher, clutching it against my throat. Calder froze. His eyes narrowed, the predatory glint in them sharpening into something focused and clinical. "You've been hiding that since the day you arrived." "It's nothing, Calder. Just a memory I don't want to see." "In this house, nothing is nothing," he countered. His voice wasn't a request. It was an ultimatum. He moved around the bed to face me, kneeling on one knee so he was eye level with me. He didn't use force, but the sheer gravity of his presence made it impossible to look away. Slowly, with a gentleness that felt more dangerous than his anger, he reached out and took my hand, uncurling my fingers from the silk. He pushed the collar of the robe aside, exposing the pale skin of my collarbone. There, just beneath the bone, was a jagged raised scar. It wasn't a clean surgical line. It was a rough, angry mark, a map of trauma that had never truly faded. Calder's breath hitched. I watched the muscle in his jaw clench until it looked like it would shatter. He reached out, his fingertip tracing the edge of the scar with a reverence that made my skin prickle. "How?" he rasped. The word was a blade. "It was the night of the accusation," I said, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Julian hadn't just screamed. He had pushed me. I fell into the glass trophy case in the foyer, the one filled with the awards he had won, that I had actually written the papers for. A shard caught me as I went down. My mother stood at the top of the stairs, watching the blood soak through my shirt. She didn't call a doctor. She told me to get out before I ruined the rug. I felt a tear slip down my cheek, hot and stinging. I walked 3 miles in the rain, holding my shoulder together. By the time I reached the free clinic, I was so cold I couldn't feel the needle when they stitched me up. That was the night I realized I was already dead to them. I was just a ghost they hadn't finished haunting. The silence that followed was absolute. Calder didn't move. He didn't speak, but the air in the room became charged with a terrifying, static energy. I looked at his face and saw something I had never seen before. Not just rage, but a cold, absolute annihilation. It wasn't the devil looking at me. It was something much older and more primal. Calder stood up, his shadow stretching across the ceiling like a giant. He didn't look at the scar anymore. He looked out at the lights of Harbor City, glowing dimly through the fog. "They watched you bleed," he said, his voice dropping to a register so low it was almost a growl. "They watched you break, and they worried about a rug." He turned back to me, and the steel blue of his eyes had turned into a frozen sea. He reached out and cupped my face, his palms warm against my damp skin. He wiped the tear away with his thumb, but his touch wasn't comforting. It was a vow. "Listen to me, Elowen," he whispered, leaning down until our foreheads touched. "I have spent my life building a world where no one can touch what is mine. I have burned empires for less than a bruise. But for this? For the mark they left on you while they laughed?" He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against my ear. "If you cry again because of them, if a single drop of grief leaves your eyes because of the Pierce name, I will not just ruin them. I will burn Harbor City to the ground just to keep you warm by the fire. I will strip the skin from their lives until there is nothing left but the memory of what they did to you." He pulled back, his hands moving to the buttons of his shirt, unfastening them with a violent efficiency. He didn't remove the shirt, but the gesture was a final, lethal signal. The rabbit was no longer just a guest or a debt to be paid. I was the core of his obsession, the one thing in a world of violence that he would protect, with a savagery that knew no borders. "They think the storm has passed," Calder said, his eyes locked onto mine. "They think they've seen the worst of me. They are about to find out that the devil doesn't just take what he wants. He punishes those who dare to touch what he loves." I looked at the man before me and realized that the Pierce family hadn't just lost their home and their money. They had created a monster that was now entirely dedicated to their destruction. And as Calder pulled me into him, his heart beating a steady rhythmic war drum against my chest, I realized I was no longer afraid of the shadows. I was the one the shadows were protecting. Chapter 9. The air in the Knox corporate headquarters was sterilized and thin, a stark contrast to the thick, salt-heavy atmosphere of the docks. I sat in a high-backed leather chair in a room made entirely of glass and polished steel, staring at a screen that displayed the heartbeat of Harbor City in real time. It wasn't a map of roads or landmarks, it was a map of movement, shipping lanes, fuel consumption, cold storage temperatures, and the silent flow of digital currency. Calder stood behind me, his reflection a dark, immovable silhouette against the backdrop of the city's skyline. He didn't wear a tie today. His shirt was open at the collar, and his sleeves were rolled to the elbows, revealing the tension in his forearms as he leaned over the desk. "You aren't looking at the numbers, Rabbit," he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to buzz against the back of my neck. "You're looking for the people. The numbers are people," I replied, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. "This delay at the South Gate, that's 300 families whose grocery prices will spike by Friday. And this shift in the fuel subsidies, that's a heating crisis for the tenement blocks near the Industrial Canal." Calder let out a soft, dark hum of amusement. "Exactly. Most of my directors see a logistical bottleneck. They see a loss of 3% on the quarterly margin. You see the cold and the hunger." He reached over my shoulder, his large hand covering mine on the mouse, guiding the cursor to a hidden encrypted folder at the corner of the screen. "That is why you are my most valuable asset. While I am the sword that breaks the gate, you are the hand that mends the wall. And a city that believes its wall is being mended by a saint will never notice the sword being sharpened behind it." As the folder opened, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was a list of charitable infrastructure projects. On the surface, it looked like a dream. The medical center I had promised Silas, a series of subsidized housing units, and a refurbished community center in the most neglected ward of the city. But as I scrolled through the subdirectories, I saw the true logistics of power. The medical center sat directly atop the main junction of the Knox underground fiber optic network. The housing units were positioned to act as a buffer zone for the private security corridors Calder used to move discretionary cargo without police interference. The community center was a perfect listening post, a place where the gratitude of the people would turn into a constant stream of intelligence. "You're using them," I whispered, turning in the chair to face him. "The kindness I showed at the docks, you're turning it into a cover for your shadow operations." Calder didn't flinch. He didn't even look away. He leaned down, his face inches from mine, his steel blue eyes locking onto me with a possessive intensity. "I am integrating them. You want Silas's grandson to have a doctor. I am giving him the best doctor in the state. In exchange, Silas's men will guard my perimeters with more loyalty than any hired mercenary. They won't do it because I pay them. They'll do it because they believe in the woman who brought them tea." He reached out, his thumb grazing the line of my jaw, a touch that was both a caress and a claim. "Kindness is a form of currency, Elowen. It buys the one thing money cannot, genuine silence. They will see you as their savior, and because you belong to me, they will see my empire as their sanctuary." I looked back at the screen, at the map where my mercy projects were perfectly aligned with his shadow corridors. It was a marriage of light and dark, a realization that my role in the Knox family wasn't just to be protected, but to be the very face of the protection itself. I was the velvet glove that made the iron fist palatable. "You're making me the heart of your machine," I said, the weight of the realization settling into my chest. "I am making you the only part that matters," Calder countered, his voice dropping to a predatory register. "The city can survive a devil, but it cannot survive without hope. You are the hope, Rabbit, and as long as you are mine, the city will never rebel against the hand that feeds it." He straightened up, his fingers lingering on my neck for a second longer than necessary. He walked to the window, watching the sunset bleed across the harbor. The Pierce family had tried to ruin my reputation by making me a common thief. They had failed so spectacularly that they had inadvertently placed me in a position where my reputation was now the foundation of the city's most powerful regime. "Is there anything in the city that isn't part of your game, Calder?" I asked. He turned his head just enough to look at me over his shoulder, the fading light catching the sharp, lethal line of his profile. "Only you. Everything else is a move on the board. But you are the reason I play the game." I looked at the blueprints for the medical center, knowing now that the basement would house things the doctors would never see. I realized then that my normal life was truly gone. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was a part of the logistics of the devil, the quiet cover for the shadow, and for the first time, I wasn't sure if that made me a saint or the most dangerous monster Harbor City had ever seen. Chapter 10. The grand ballroom of the Harbor City Heights Hotel was a cathedral of excess, dripping in gold leaf and illuminated by crystal chandeliers that looked like frozen explosions of light. It was the annual Autumn Equinox Gala, the one night where the city's old blood and new money merged into a singular predatory mass. I stood at the edge of the dance floor, my fingers clutching a crystal flute of sparkling water, wearing a gown of emerald silk that felt like a weight of expectation. Calder was across the room, surrounded by a circle of senators and developers, his presence a dark sun around which the entire event orbited. Even from a distance I could feel the eyes of the room on me. I wasn't Elowen Pierce tonight. I was a curiosity, a scandal in a designer dress. I was the girl who had been cast out into the mud and dragged into the devil's lair, and the old guard women of Harbor City didn't hide their disdain. To them my presence was a violation of the hierarchy they spent lifetimes pruning. "You look lost, dear. Or perhaps you're just waiting for someone to tell you which fork to use." I turned to see Genevieve Sterling, a woman whose family name was etched into the copper of the city's oldest foundations. She was draped in diamonds, and a smile that held the warmth of a glacier. Beside her stood two other women, their expressions mirrored in a collective, sharp-edged arrogance. "I'm doing fine, Genevieve," I said, keeping my voice low and steady. "The forks are the easy part. It's the company that requires a bit more navigation." Genevieve's smile didn't falter, but her eyes darkened. She stepped closer, the scent of her cloyingly sweet perfume invading my space. "You think because Calder Knox decided to keep you as a pet that you belong here? You're a Pierce castoff, an orphan by choice. You have no lineage, no standing, and no shame. You're a stain on the silk of this room." "I have a name," I countered. "And I have a memory. Something your family seems to have lost when they traded their integrity for city contracts." Genevieve's face flushed a mottled red. "How dare you speak to me about integrity? You're a charity case living in a monster's house." With a movement that was too deliberate to be accidental, Genevieve tilted her glass. The deep crimson of the expensive Bordeaux cascaded down the front of my emerald gown, the stain spreading like a fresh wound across the silk. The coldness of the liquid seeped through the fabric, hitting my skin and making me gasp. The surrounding tables went quiet. The chime of silverware stopped. "Oh, how clumsy of me," Genevieve drawled, her voice loud enough to carry to the center of the room. "But then again, a bit of wine shouldn't bother someone used to sleeping in the dirt. It matches your reputation, cheap and messy." I stood frozen, the wine dripping onto the marble floor. The humiliation was a hot, stinging prickle at the back of my eyes, but I refused to let a single tear fall. I remembered Calder's vow. I remembered the scar beneath my collarbone. The silence in the ballroom didn't just grow, it solidified. It was the kind of silence that precedes a landslide. I looked past Genevieve's shoulder and saw the circle around Calder part like a curtain. He didn't run. He didn't shout. He walked toward us with a rhythmic, heavy stride that seemed to vibrate through the floor. The senators and developers stepped back, their faces pale, sensing the change in the air. Calder's eyes were no longer steel blue, they were the color of a winter sky before a blackout. He stopped 2 feet from Genevieve. He didn't look at her. He looked at the stain on my dress, his jaw clenching with a lethal tension. Then he looked at me. "Are you hurt, Rabbit?" he asked, his voice a low, terrifying vibration. "I'm just wet, Calder," I whispered. "It's just wine." "It is a violation," he corrected. Calder turned his gaze to Genevieve. She tried to maintain her smirk, but as his eyes locked onto hers, her glass began to tremble in her hand. The diamonds on her neck seemed to choke her as she realized the gravity of the man standing before her. "Genevieve Sterling," Calder said, his voice dropping to a register that made the chandeliers above us hum. "Your father is currently begging me for a seat on the harbor board. Your husband is 3 weeks away from a margin call on his shipping fleet, a call that I happen to own." Calder reached for the top button of his jacket. The room gasped. In the secret language of Harbor City power, the devil's unbuttoned jacket was the final signal. It meant the business was over and the violence had begun. He unfastened the first button, then the second. He shrugged the tailored garment off his shoulders and handed it to a waiter without looking, standing in his black silk shirt, his broad shoulders and athletic frame, a stark, predatory contrast to the tuxedoed men around him. "You called her an orphan," Calder said, stepping into Genevieve's personal space. She backed away until she hit the edge of a buffet table. "You thought that because she has no blood family to protect her, she was fair game for your pettiness." Calder leaned in, his shadow swallowing her whole. "Elowen Pierce is the only thing in this city that is off limits. To touch her is to touch me. To insult her is to declare war on the Knox name. And as of this moment, Genevieve, the Sterlings are at war. It was an accident." Genevieve stammered, her voice high and thin. "I'll pay for the dress." You'll leave," Calder interrupted. "You will walk out of those doors, and you will not stop until you are outside the city limits. By morning, your family's credit lines will be severed. By noon, your estate will be under audit. You wanted to talk about dirt, Genevieve? I'm going to make sure you have plenty of time to get acquainted with it." He didn't wait for her to move. He turned back to me, his expression softening by a fraction of a percent, a change only I could see. He reached out and cupped my cheek, his thumb grazing my skin. "Let's go, Elowen," he said. "The air in here has become foul." He swept his arm around my waist, pulling me into his side with an absolute, crushing possessiveness. We walked through the center of the ballroom, the elite of Harbor City parting like a sea before a storm. No one spoke. No one dared to look away. They watched us go, knowing that the rabbit wasn't just a pet. She was the heart of the devil's obsession, and the city had just watched the first of its old pillars crumble because of a single glass of wine. As we reached the doors, I looked back at the golden room. I wasn't the girl from the plaza anymore. I was the woman who had seen the devil unbutton his jacket for her. And for the first time, I realized that the only person Genevieve Sterling should have been afraid of was me. Chapter 11. The Harbor City Visionary Gala was intended to be the Pierce family's resurrection. They had spent their remaining liquid assets on a table positioned directly beneath the podium, desperate to project an aura of stability they no longer possessed. My father sat stiffly, his face a map of broken capillaries and suppressed panic, while my mother adjusted her pearls with hands that wouldn't stop trembling. Beside them, my sister Faye, preened in a dress of shimmering silver, the same dress she had claimed was her own design, the centerpiece of the visionary bid they hoped would win back the city's favor. I stood in the shadows of the mezzanine, watching them through the glass. Beside me, Calder stood in a state of preternatural stillness. He wasn't wearing his jacket. He had arrived in a black dress shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal the powerful tension in his forearms. He looked less like a CEO, and more like an executioner waiting for the clock to strike the hour. "They look so confident," I whispered, my eyes fixed on Faye. "She really thinks she's won." "Confidence is just a lack of information, Rabbit," Calder replied, his voice a low, predatory rumble. "They believe they are here to receive a contract. They don't realize they are here to receive a verdict." He reached out and squeezed my shoulder, his touch a grounding force. "Are you ready? Once we step onto that floor, there is no turning back to the girl you were." "I stopped being that girl the night I met you," I said, meeting his steel blue gaze. We descended the stairs as the master of ceremonies approached the microphone. The room was a sea of Harbor City's most powerful players, all waiting for the announcement of the billion-dollar New Horizon development contract. "Tonight," the MC announced, his voice echoing through the vaulted hall, "we recognize the visionary who will lead our city's infrastructure into the next decade. The board has reviewed the submissions, and one design stood above the rest for its integration of community medical care and logistical efficiency. Please join me in welcoming the head of the New Horizon project." My father stood up, a smug, practiced smile spreading across his face. He nudged Faye, who began to rise, smoothing her silver gown, ready to take the stage and claim the glory she had stolen from my private sketches months ago. However, the MC continued, his tone shifting to something colder. "Before we award the contract, there is the matter of the intellectual property audit conducted by Knox Industries." The room went silent. The Pierces froze. Calder stepped into the light of the ballroom floor, his hand firmly on the small of my back, guiding me toward the stage. We didn't stop at the guest tables. We walked straight past the Pierce family, who stared at us with mouths agape, as if seeing a pair of ghosts. "Elowen," my mother gasped, her voice a thin reed of terror. We ignored her. We ascended the stage. Calder took the microphone, his presence expanding until the massive room felt small. "The Pierce family submitted a design under the name of Faye Pierce," Calder began, his eyes sweeping the room like a searchlight. "A design that promised empathy and efficiency. But upon further investigation of the Knox private servers, the very servers the Pierces attempted to hack. Last week, we found something interesting." He signaled to the giant screen behind us. It didn't show the blueprints. It showed a time-stamped video from the Pierce foyer, taken 6 months ago. It was the night of my disgrace. The footage was grainy but clear. It showed Faye entering my room, taking my leather-bound portfolio, and then, with a cold, calculated smile, shattering the glass trophy case and pushing me into the shards. It showed the blood on the floor. It showed my mother walking past me without a glance. A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. The old money elite, who lived for reputation, looked at the screen with horror. Faye's face turned the color of ash. She sat back down so hard her chair nearly tipped. "The designs were stolen," Calder said, his voice dropping to a register that made the floorboards vibrate. "But the woman who created them is standing right here. Elowen Pierce, the daughter you discarded, is the visionary you've been looking for. And as of tonight, she is the only person in Harbor City with the authority to sign your checks." Calder reached into his pocket and pulled out a single black card, tossing it onto the podium. "The Pierce family assets are frozen. Their debt has been called in. And because the New Horizon project sits on land now owned exclusively by the Knox Foundation, the Pierces are officially trespassed from the very project they tried to steal." I stepped up to the microphone, looking down at my father. He looked small. He looked like the monster under the bed when the lights are finally turned on. "You told me I was a stain on the name," I said, my voice echoing with a quiet, lethal clarity. "You told me I was nothing without the Pierce bloodline. But look at you now. You have the name, but I have the city. And I think I'll start my first day of work by seeing you out of this building." Security stepped forward, the same men who had guarded the cafe, and began to escort the Pierces from the room. My mother was weeping. My father was shouting about lawyers. Faye was hiding her face in her hands. They were dismantled in front of the very people they had spent their lives trying to impress. Calder turned to me, his steel blue eyes burning with a dark, triumphant pride. He didn't care about the contract. He didn't care about the city. He cared about the way I stood, tall, unbroken, and entirely his. He reached for the buttons of his shirt, unfastening the top two with a slow, deliberate motion. The signal was finalized. The war was over. The devil had won, and his rabbit was finally the one holding the crown. "The room is yours, Elowen," he whispered, leaning in so only I could hear. "Tell them what happens next." I looked out at the silent, expectant crowd, and then back at the man who had burned a family to save a girl. I realized then that I wasn't just safe. I was the true power of Harbor City. Chapter 12. The aftermath of the gala felt like the cooling of a forge. Outside the grand ballroom, the world was still turning. But the landscape of Harbor City had been fundamentally altered. The Pierces were gone. Not just from the building, but from the very fabric of the city's elite. I watched from the high-arched windows as their single remaining car, a battered sedan they must have borrowed or rented in their desperation, pulled away from the curb. They had no home to return to, no accounts to draw from, and a reputation that was now a toxic brand no one would dare touch. They were finally as invisible as they had once tried to make me. Calder stood beside me, his presence a dark, grounding heat in the quiet of the emptying hall. He didn't look at the street. He didn't need to see their departure to know they were broken. He simply watched my reflection in the glass, his steel blue eyes searching for any flicker of the girl who had once craved their approval. "It's quiet," I whispered, my breath hitching slightly. "For the first time in 24 years, the noise of their expectations is just gone." "That isn't silence, Elowen," Calder said, his voice a low, melodic rumble. "That is the sound of a vacuum waiting to be filled. You didn't just survive them, you replaced them." He reached out and took my hand, his fingers lacing through mine with a possessive strength. He led me away from the ballroom, away from the lingering gazes of the curious and the terrified, toward the private lift that ascended to the very peak of the hotel, the Knox penthouse. When the doors opened, the cool night air of the harbor rushed in to meet us. The penthouse balcony was a vast stone promontory that felt as though it were suspended between the stars and the sea. Below us, Harbor City was a sprawling grid of electric amber and neon blue, a machine of millions that was now, in a very real sense, operating under our design. I walked to the railing, the emerald silk of my gown snapping in the wind. I looked down at the distant plaza where it had all begun, the spot where I had knelt in the mud, where Julian had knotted his hand in my hair, and where the world had first seen the devil unbutton his jacket. From this height, the mud was invisible. The monsters were just ants. Calder stepped up behind me, his chest pressing against my back, his arms coming around to rest on the railing, effectively encasing me in his shadow. He had discarded his shirt entirely at some point in the transition, the cold night air seemingly unable to touch the furnace of his skin. "Do you see it?" he asked, his chin resting near my temple. The medical center at the north gate. The shipping lanes at the south. The architecture of your mercy, and my iron. It's no longer a map of a city, Rabbit. It's a map of your inheritance. I don't want to be a monster, Calder, I said, turning slightly in the circle of his arms. I don't want people to look at me the way they look at you, with their hearts in their throats. Calder leaned down, his face inches from mine, his eyes unreadable in the moonlight. They don't look at you with fear. They look at you with hope, but they look at us with the knowledge that hope is protected by a predator. You provide the heart, Elowen. I provide the teeth. One cannot survive in Harbor City without the other. He reached out, his thumb tracing the faint, jagged line of the scar on my collarbone, the permanent mark of the night I was discarded. The girl in the mud is dead. The Pierces killed her, and I buried the remains. The woman standing here now, she doesn't hide her scars. She uses them to remind the world why she's in charge. I looked out over the skyline, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a guest in a gilded cage. I didn't feel like a debt to be paid, or a rabbit to be shielded. I felt the weight of the city, the complexity of the logistics, and the absolute terrifying safety of the man holding me. The Pierce family had spent decades trying to build a throne out of lies and cruelty, only to have it collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. I had built nothing but a reputation for kindness and resilience, and yet, here I was, standing at the summit. I'm not a Pierce anymore, I said, my voice steady and clear, carrying over the wind of the harbor. No, Calder whispered, his lips grazing the shell of my ear, a dark promise of forever. You are a Nox. You are the queen of the Devil's Empire, and as long as I draw breath, no one will ever make you kneel again. I leaned back into him, watching the lights of the city twinkle like 1,000 silent witnesses. The transition was complete. The abandonment was a memory. The obsession was my reality. I was no longer the girl running from the storm. I was the one who controlled the lightning. As the moon hung high over the harbor, the devil and his rabbit stood together, and for the first time in history, the city below was perfectly, obediently still. From the mud of a public plaza to the absolute summit of Harbor City, Elowen's journey proves that the quietest hearts often hold the most explosive power. She didn't just survive the betrayal of her blood. She allowed the devil to burn down her past so she could build a future where mercy is backed by iron. The Pierce family learned too late that when you cast out a diamond, you shouldn't be surprised when it returns to reclaim the crown. If you enjoyed this tale of dark romance and ultimate revenge, don't let the story end here. Like this video if you loved seeing the Pierces get what they deserved. Comment below with your favorite face-slapping moment. Was it the gala reveal or Calder unbuttoning his jacket? Share this story with someone who loves a strong heroine and a protective, morally gray hero. Subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss a chapter of high-stakes drama and obsessive devotion.